Namaste, everyone. My colleagues, the brilliant Cari Kniola and the effulgent Brandy Chittester, are going to discuss risk management in clinical trials. It's a favorite topic for some, not so favorite for some of the others. In most cases, a clinical study is the most important and expensive design validation you're ever going to run for your medical device, in vitro diagnostic, and or combination product. Now, risk to a clinical trial comes not just from trial design, but also from aspects relating to budget, quality, timelines, site selection, enrollment dynamics, and safety-related items. Now, these risks can seriously affect the outcome of trials in multiple ways. And just like product development, it's critical to identify, evaluate, and mitigate these risks when designing a study, as well as choosing your CRO partner. So plenty to be careful about. Let's get into the questions. And my first question is for you, Cari. It's a loaded question. Typically, who is responsible for managing risk in a clinical study, and what are the main risks to clinical trials? Also, what are some of the risk-based guidelines when it comes to the conduct of these clinical trials?
So as far as who's responsible for risks, I mean, big picture, everyone, right? Everyone who's touching the study should be thinking about risks. The sponsor knows their part of maybe certain things about the product or certain things that we need to keep an eye on. The study team knows a certain parts about their functional area that they need to think about risk. So it's not necessarily one person's responsibility. In theory, the project manager is the one who is kind of holding those risks, right? And really, from a big picture perspective, keeping an eye on what's happening and reviewing them on a regular basis. But really, I think the approach to successful risk management is that everyone has a part in it, and that there you have this key kind of stakeholder in the project manager who is really watching over the whole thing. From a top risks perspective, I think historically, I know when I was coming up in project management, a lot of the risks we focused on were things like timelines and enrollment, some of the basics of a study. And as things have evolved, and especially with ICH E6R3 coming out, the focus has really turned, as it should, to endpoints and safety. What is going to ultimately put the study at risk from being a viable study, regardless of the outcome of the study? Is it going to be viable at the end? Are you collecting all the data you need to? Are there any things that really could put that data at risk? And so when we're looking at risks for study, those are the types of things that we're looking at. Endpoint safety, some of those really big ticket items that ultimately impact everything else too. But that's really what we need to focus on. And, there's been a lot of talk recently with RBQM and, the risk-based monitoring and everything from ICH to FDA putting out specific guidelines that has really turned that focus to risk management and making it not just a box that we check, but something that is an integral part of the study from the very beginning.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, just exactly what Cari's saying, when you think about the risk-based monitoring guidance, I mean, it came out in 2013, and sometimes you still hear people trying to wrap their heads around it. And then we got to frequently asked questions just last year. But thinking from that monitoring perspective, we take the protocol and the risks that the sponsor came up with. So we know what are the expected safety risks that we're looking for. What are maybe some pitfalls or some challenges for using the device that we need to be looking for. And then we build this in, to our approach for monitoring and working with the actual sites and principal investigators. There are, back to Cari's point, some things that we're always going to be looking at from a risk perspective: informed consent, safety information, endpoint data, eligibility criteria. But the rest we can kind of build based on the project specifics and the device itself.
Brandy, I want to delve into that a little bit more. Now, from your experience, what are some of the system level and trial level risks that, if ignored, could spell trouble, both from a design as well as a conduct perspective?
Yeah, great question. Sorry. I think it kind of even pulling back once a protocol is written and we kind of have an idea of what data we want to look for and what is meaningful to show the device is safe and effective. Is it executable? So taking that protocol and really walking through, where are the pitfalls? Are these tests normally done? Do we have access to the types of maybe imaging or different test results we want? Are the windows around visits reasonable? Are the patients going to be able to hit those time points? Is it a burden? Is it, too infrequent? So I've even seen cases where a sponsor might work with one of their key sites and say, let's just walk through this and imagine, the patient journey, and can we do all of these tests? And do we have to go from this location to that location, or how are we going to communicate? I mean, just really working through the actual protocol and how it's done is really helpful ahead of time to mitigate some risks before you got patients involved.
So, all right. So let's move on to the next one. So in the risk assessment phase, experience and expertise in clinical project management process and an understanding of the therapeutic area will help identify various risks that might occur throughout the clinical project lifecycle. That's what I'm getting from what you're saying. Now, in your experience, what are some of these risks that will enable an effective risk management plan?
So risk management plans happen. So a lot of times as a CRO, we're coming in, the product's been designed, maybe the protocol's been written. So it all kind of depends on when you're getting involved. But at the end of the day, that risk assessment is taking everyone's experience, whether it's engineers, whether it's data management, whether it's monitoring, taking everyone's experience with that therapeutic area, with the procedure, with their particular functional area, and just knowing some of the things that happen and applying that to the study, and really talking amongst, when we put our RACT, or risk assessment and categorization tool, together at the beginning of the study, we are sitting down cross-functionally with the sponsor internally, going through the endpoints, looking at where the data is being collected, looking at some processes that might impact or pose a risk, and just brainstorming. Really, it's like, what could go wrong? What could impact this? And everyone brings their own bit of experience to that piece. And so it's really great. Again, historically, it was kind of the project manager who kind of sat back and said, I wonder what's going to happen. And now it is more and more. And the way we do it is like it's the whole team getting together, and everyone's experience plays a huge part. And really having a thorough risk assessment at the beginning to think of all the things that could happen. And while we're identifying those, we also need to think about how are we going to track them, right? Like, where's the data coming from? Is it something that we have to be on site to see? Is it something that we need to look at the data in a special way to make sure we are tracking it? So all of those things, along with the identifying the risk, is that whole, tracking the data source. Do we need to have this in a plan? Is this something that, let's get the mitigation set up? So it's all part of that initial piece.
Coming from the ClinOps perspective, after we perform that exercise and we find those risks, especially related to what are we going to see during monitoring visits or through interacting with the clinical sites, we'll build those into our monitoring plan. And, long gone are the days of we're going to go on site every 6 weeks or every 3 months. We're going to go based on what's happening at the site. And maybe it's based on a certain enrollment amount, because there's some things we could kind of check on, but maybe not. Maybe it's based on how does each site kind of look. So we're going to look at everything centrally and see who's sticking out. Some sites have more adverse events. Some sites have more protocol deviations. Some sites are slower to give us data at all? What are these things that could be putting us at risk, whether we know or don't know? And then we're going to address them that way.
Now, Brandy, you touched upon sites. Can you briefly discuss, investigator or site preparedness? In other words, what goes into audit readiness?
Yeah, great question. We build that in from the beginning, and that's kind of just inherent in our process of working with the site. So a lot of times, one of the things that we do when we're on site is check source data verification. It's just one thing. And so if we see a gap and we're just not sure how the source matches the data, or maybe there's a couple source that might match and it's a little confusing, we want to identify those, we want to close them. And usually we kind of come at it with the, if you were to have an audit tomorrow, is it clear? Or if you have an audit in 12 months, will you remember this? Because of course it seems obvious today, but we're going to forget that in for sure 12 months, or maybe you won't be here. So we kind of work with that mindset the whole time. And related, one important task that we have is meeting with the principal investigators, and they're always very busy. And it can be really easy to say, everything's going fine. I'll just catch them at the next visit, or her. But the truth is, if there are any issues and they are audited, certainly that communication is important, but we never want to be in a situation where there's an issue and then they say, why didn't you tell me? It was important enough to tell me. So we always kind of work with that mindset of, timely communication and just thinking of being ready always.
There are plenty more questions in my mind, but I promise I'll make this the last question. So just trying to bring everything together. When does one start thinking about risk? Do you have any tips when it comes to risk monitoring and risk control? And also, all my questions need to be loaded, right? What are some of the best practices to mitigate risk in trials?
We need to be thinking about risk from the very beginning. I mean, really, when we're writing the protocol, even before you start writing the protocol, when you're coming up with your strategy, like what effective risk management starts early, and it never stops, really. Like you do your initial assessment, but part of that effective monitoring is you don't check the box and put it away. This is something that you revisit every month and understand what's happening. Maybe you can put some to rest, maybe some are being realized, and update them. Maybe you've discovered new ones along the way, right? So it is a living process that starts at the very beginning and goes all the way through the end of the study. Continuous communication. And the mitigation part, having that a good mitigation and an effective mitigation and a mitigation that is achievable. So you don't want to make your mitigation so like crazy that it's not something that can actually happen. So is this a realistic way to solve this problem should it actually occur? And it just takes the panic out, right? So, okay, well, all right, this happened, but we know how we're going to fix it. So let's just do it. And so that's part of that, keeping the end in mind through the whole thing.
You got to really think too about when you're lucky enough to have issues that are minimal, but they actually could have been a major issue. So I say lucky because it wasn't major, but it could have been. Address them. Pretend it was major and address it that way so that you don't end up being unlucky the next time. So you got,
So think about risk and plan for it early on itself. Involve cross-functional experts whenever possible. Because like I said earlier on, this is probably the most important and expensive design validation you'll likely run on your device, and trials can make or break these devices. That said, Cari and Brandy, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, thoughts, and expertise in connection with risk management and clinical trials.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks.